we are talking once again about David Lynch stuff. This time, not Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
And I'm excited, really excited to hear from you about your new book. And let me show it. We've had some technical difficulties today, so I think this should looks okay.
It looks great.
Yeah, and it's got an interesting title, and I guess I'm just thinking of this question now. Let's talk about the diction. So each of these words was chosen, and are there any word choices in the that are interesting to you or worth elaborating on?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. This was a hard one. Well, I'm just only the third book I've done, so I didn't know for a long time. Doing the cover and the title on this was just trickier than the last time. With Ominous Whoosh, I knew the title at a certain point, and it was pretty clear. And I knew the cover. I always knew what the cover was going to be, and I knew how I was going to do it. But with this one, I struggled for quite some time with what the title would be. And I don't know how I came up with it. At some point, what I really liked about Devious Dreams was that it had the same rhythm as Ominous Whoosh. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do that. And then I made sure, I mean, I looked up the word devious, which I included the full definition of the word devious at the
Yeah.
beginning of the book, because I think some people, the word, it seems to suggest sinister, which would apply, I think, to some extent to the film Mulholland Drive, but a devious also, is sort of roundabout or kind of hidden, and all of those were definitions. Multiple definitions of devious apply to Mulholland Drive. So, and then I was gonna just say reimagining Mulholland Drive, but I realized with Mulholland Drive, it's a real place, and I needed to put David Lynch's, reimagining David Lynch's Mulholland Drive in there, which was a little longer than I wanted it to be, but that was the choices I made. Then I mean, if you wanted me to keep going on this cover, I really did not know what I was going to do for the cover, what picture I was going to do. I mean, I thought about using the Mulholland Drive sign. I thought about, finding a way to use it, or the Hollywood sign that's in Hollywood, a shot of Mulholland Drive at night, the blue box, I just a number of things. And then I was for a long time I was going to do, the red sheets that Diane Selwyn falls into at the beginning of the film. I was going to have sort of this bed, this so abstract kind of background, and that I knew at a certain point it has to be the blue key. And then there was a long, and I do mean a rather long struggle to find the key, which I won't go into. This is too boring, but I mean, it took me a long time to find the key, and I finally found a close enough key. I wanted the exact key, but I could not locate it. So there it is, a long story about the cover.
Give me the 30-second version of the finding of the key story, because I know a lot. I know, at least in the world of Twin Peaks, I know there are a lot of fans that are fascinated with like tracking props down or tracking back.
Yeah, and I might have been able to reach out to some people to help me. I didn't. They don't make keys with those little. If you hold up the cover, you'll see there's a circle or a little hole, a little round hole, which is what's in the key that's in Mulholland Drive, has a round hole in it. Well, nowadays it's three triangles. They use, I guess, less metal or whatever. And so I went on eBay looking for vintage keys, and I went to three or four locksmiths to try to find one, and they were like, "Well, we just did that. They don't make that anymore." And so finally I tracked down a key on eBay, which is different, and blah, blah, blah. I made it work. I had to get it cut too. I mean, the key
Oh,
that I
okay.
got was a blank key, and so then I had to find a key and I will tell you, it is not my home key. So I found it just an old key somewhere and had that cut for that. So
And then there is another word in the title, and that is dreams. I don't think you've discussed that yet.
oh well, I mean, yeah, it that's the main theory of the book, is that that we're looking at much of the film as a dream. Of course, dream, and I use the word a couple of times in the book, dream also has another meaning other than just, a vision we have while we're asleep. It can be a goal. It can be something where, an aspiration we hope to achieve something. It's our dream. And that applies to the character of Diane Selwyn, who had dreams of making it big in Hollywood.
Yeah. So the devious in front of that noun works in a lot of different ways.
That's right. Yeah.
And is your book a key?
I hope that, I mean, with any David Lynch film, of course, there's multiple ways to read it, and people have to find their own comfort with any David Lynch work. What is the interpretation that makes you most comfortable? And so I would never say I've figured it out, but I think Mulholland Drive is an unusual film, and I go into a lot of discussion about why it's unique in Lynch's body of work, and he kind of had to be rather explicit, more so than usual, in how the narrative works in this film. And so I feel very, very strongly that the film is broken into two parts. So the first part is a dream, and the last part is a real, the events of the real world that inspired that dream or impacted that dream. And so I'm uncomfortable calling it my book a key, but I do think it's sort of a hopefully it's a good guide to the film.
Yeah, I would agree, and it certainly was for me. I'm by no means any expert in this film. I think I've seen it twice and 2.5 times. My wife bailed out. I think it was just one of those nights.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, but reading through the book I found it really persuasive, and so in some sense it operated as unlocking certain ideas. And this is a movie watching once is not sufficient anyway. I think it's intended to, it's intended for rewatching. But before I ask you about some of the backstory behind your process of writing this book,
talk to me.
Do you want me to read from there to the end? I could do that.
Would you mind?
No, I don't mind. That's actually a good section. So this is after I've gone through the history and the analysis of Mulholland Drive. Making Mulholland Drive the story of a unique, albeit tragic character is how David Lynch salvaged the Mulholland Drive TV pilot. Lynch understood that for the story to have meaning, to connect with audiences on a visceral level, to have the power to move us emotionally, it had to have a human being at its core. When we watch Mulholland Drive for the first time, we don't know we're seeing a story told through a dreaming mind. We don't realize we're witnessing the reflections of a troubled psyche. Only at the end of the film, in Act 3, do we become aware of the larger story at play. By then, and especially if we're watching the film in the theater, it's too late to go back and untangle Diane's dream to see how it conveys her various anxieties and desires. But when we rewatch Mulholland Drive, we evaluate it with different context. We read Mulholland Drive's first act as a dream, and we see a deliberate scheme at play. The construction of the film, the arrangement of and transition between scenes, the use of sound and music, the movement of the camera encodes Diane's fear, guilt, and objection. A sense of desperation permeates the whole of it, implying a mind behind the story. Hidden in its discursive shadows, masterly interpolated by David Lynch, Diane Selwyn is a presence throughout. Mulholland Drive puts forth a puzzle, and it's up to us to put the pieces together. Daunting and elusive, haunting and elusive, Mulholland Drive opens minds.
I hope many people will read it, and I'm sure those who do will enjoy it. And I personally hope to hear from people who are currently reading the book or who have read it. And because if you like this book and you like this writer, we'll probably get along. So, a general question is writing a book lonely?
It might be for some people. I mean, it is something you do really. Uh, I mean, there's no one else writing it. You're the one writing it. So, although I often conferred with people, Josh Eisenstadt, I mentioned in the book, it was a huge help. I would text him and we would talk on the phone on occasion. And I had some other people, you bounce ideas off. But when you're actually writing it, yeah, you're by yourself. That doesn't bother me at all. I like that. It's very meditative for me. It can be frustrating. It can be tiresome, but for the most part, it's I like that time where I'm able to really focus on something and explore it. And oftentimes, you find things you had no idea you were going to find as you're writing. You're just like, wow, okay. It sort of comes in the moment. So that's great.
And I imagine that happened again with this book. I know that happened quite a bit with your previous book. Um, is there anything that's jumping to mind as far as like sort of thoughts that uncovered themselves while writing? So,
Yeah,
some people say, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Some people say, "What's the phrase?" It's like, "How do I know what I think till I see what I say?" And they use writing as a process of sort of like clearing out the mind, so to speak. Was that happening for you?
yeah, definitely. I mean, that happens. I think that happens no matter what I'm writing about. But like when I was writing about Twin Peaks, all the times I've been writing about Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks: The Return was the last book. You know, sometimes you don't know. You think you know, and you follow those thoughts down a path, and then you realize this isn't working. So why isn't it working? And then you come up with something else. And again, those are oftentimes just your own. This works for me,
Yeah.
type of thing. With Mulholland Drive was a little different in that, um, the film had been for me. I'd seen the film 25 years ago, or about 25 years ago, and I've seen it a number of times, but I sort of formulated ideas back in 2001, 2002 that I carried with me all those years. I was like, this is how this works. This is why that happens the way it does. And then when I was writing about it, I realized, wait a minute, it's still this something's not working. I don't know why. I always thought, and a perfect example is the elderly couple who appear a number of times in the film. They're the people who escort Betty through the airport at the beginning of the film, and then we see them again by themselves in the back of a limo laughing, and they look kind of like now they're evil figures. And I had an interpretation of that I always felt, that's what that means. And it wasn't until and in fact, I wrote that. I wrote that interpretation. It wasn't until later that I was like, this doesn't really make it doesn't satisfy enough. The interpretation I had was that the old couple that Diane, this dreaming mind. I'm saying that there was somebody's dreaming, that Diane Selwyn is dreaming this, and she blames these people for her bad luck.
Mm.
And it's sort of a convenient way of looking at them. It wasn't until I was looking at it more closely, and I think I want to think that David Lynch was sort of stuck with certain elements of the pilot, and now we're getting on to things we haven't talked about, and that he had to reorient, or he had to orient viewers in a certain, he had to signal viewers in a certain way. And I think the old couple function in a different way, that they, for Diane, are people that she the real people in her life that she thinks that she's disappointed. And so they're sort of judging her rather than, actively manipulating her, which really doesn't ultimately work. But if she herself, if we look at the psychology of this character, then these figures, these elderly figures, they represent a guilt in her, or they represent a disappointment that, that she has disappointed them. So I went down into some real detail before we got maybe to other elements that we maybe needed to support what I'm talking about there. But just in general, that is an example of where for 25 years I thought I knew, I felt comfortable with it, and then sort of confronted with, okay, now I'm not so sure. And that's what happens when you're working on something, so closely, and you're giving it so much thought. You're literally looking at almost edit by edit. You start to think, okay, there might be a better way to explain what some of these things mean.
That's interesting. Edit by edit, like, so you're there watching with a mouse or a remote in your hand, and you're going back and forth. You watching things in like slow motion sometimes.
No, but I did. I mean, I had the it was the mouse. I had it on my computer screen, and so I would look at scenes over and over and over again if I had to. And I had the script too, which is online. I was able to pull it. It's the script to the pilot of Mulholland Drive, so it was almost the entire film. And but yeah, I didn't do slow motion. It probably would have helped in a couple of places, but yeah, you just get real forensic. You really start to take it apart and look at why this scene ends when it does, why the music plays past that scene. I mean, all of those things are deliberate, and they're deliberate. So if they're deliberate, then why? And then you theorize from that.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of fascinating sound stuff happening in this film. And we know that David Lynch made a big deal out of the film being played with a certain sound level in theaters, and so he really wanted to make sure that all the work that they put in, and a lot of it is almost at a subconscious level, but wanted to make sure that all that work sort of could be experienced. It's a very different film when you listen to it on good headphones or really loud speakers versus just listening to it.
Yeah, I think, David Lynch is usually credited at the end of his movies as one of the sound editor or one of the sound designers, or I mean, his name pops up in that sound section of the credits, and it was that in Inland Empire and in Lost Highway, and certainly in Twin Peaks: The Return. And he really, if sound is so important to him, and I know you've talked to people who've examined the sound, and it's so easy because film is such a visual medium. It's so easy to not connect what the sounds are telling us and just looking at the pictures. And there is a lot that you can derive from the way he uses sound and music. And again, there are scenes where the music will play out of one scene and into another scene, and that wasn't an accident. It wasn't. I mean, they're not sitting there in their complex sound design control rooms, going, "Whoops, we went too long." They're very precise. They're very deliberate about what they're doing, and there's meaning behind it.
Yeah, for sure, and fascinating. And you talked about the script for the pilot being online. Earlier today, I had 30 minutes. I had a crazy day, by the way, but
okay. Well, I know what that's like.
I had 30 minutes free, and I found in 2019 the Twin Peaks Unwrapped podcast episode. It was you and Joel Bacco and Maya. I forget her. I'm blanking on her last. Sorry. And you guys were talking about Mulholland Drive. It was very interesting. It was, and there was a lot not said that is said in the book. So that tells me that you personally have changed a lot, or gotten more precise in your reading of the film. And I would imagine so with all the work you did in this book. But also one of the things you said in that episode was that you had almost like a novel or novella version of like an early script.
I'm sorry, you glitched for a minute there. If you could repeat that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I gotta.
Yeah. I have lost you. Can you hear me, Anthony?
Hey, I'm sorry, John.
That's fine.
That was Uncle Buddy. Uncle Buddy was trying to call me.
Okay, okay. You'll have to edit that out.
Yeah,
Well, phone
Uncle Buddy.
calls are important in Mulholland Drive. They
Exactly.
really are. So that may have been a meaning something was happening there.
Yeah, Uncle Buddy has well over 138 Special Olympics medals, mainly in the sports of basketball, track and field, and
Wow,
bowling.
wow. I'll
Yeah,
tell you, there's that if that isn't a David Lynch name, I don't know what is. Uncle Buddy. I mean, that sounds like it comes right out of like the Fat Trout Trailer Park,
that's perfect. He has some great T-shirts. One of them is a shirt with his own face on it, full
Uh-huh.
size. And then another one is it just says my great Uncle Buddy in like gigantic white letters on a blue
Uh,
T-shirt. My daughter now owns that shirt and wears it to school.
yeah.
But um I'm gonna edit all this out. Um yeah, so you were saying like a very early version of the pilot was almost like novelistic in terms of like the detail that was in there. Did I hear that correctly?
So well, I can comment a little bit on that podcast, although it's been 5 years, I guess. They wanted to talk about Mulholland Drive, the pilot versus the film. And the pilot version that they were looking at was that there are two versions of the pilot for people who don't know. And one was 2 hours and 5 minutes long, and that's the one that David Lynch delivered to ABC, and it's the one that he expected that they would show, and it's the one that he was happy with. Uh, there's a long story, which I go into in great detail in the book, about what happened there, and ABC essentially forced Lynch to make edits to that pilot to shorten it. He did not want to do it, but he did it. And so what happens is there now a second version of the pilot, and it's 88 minutes long. That was the version of the pilot which circulated on videotape, and people got a hold of it. And that was the version of the pilot that that podcast was looking at and comparing it to the film. And so I was probably commenting on the fact that I had seen the longer version of the pilot, the 2 hour and 5 minute version of the pilot, which, as far as I know, is not available to anyone anywhere. I was just very, very lucky that I had a chance to see it. And that is the pilot that I refer to and compare the final film to, and use essentially as the starting point to explain what changes Lynch made in the film from that pilot to convey this new reading of the story, that he rethought the story, and added an ending to it that it didn't initially have. So I think in that podcast, I know I was thinking of the longer pilot because I had never seen the 88-minute pilot. I've seen parts of it, but there's no point in seeing it really, because it was never what Lynch intended. It never was anything that he wanted to put out there. So there's a value in looking at it to some extent, but not when it comes to the way Lynch approaches art. That was something he did not want to do. He was forced to do. And so anyway, another long answer. I'm not quite sure all the things you're maybe referencing that I may have said in that podcast, but I know they were talking about that 88-minute pilot.
Yeah, I apologize for asking such an obscure
question. It's
question.
fine. Yeah.
I think Joel was asking if there was like initially a female co-writer, because he was hearing rumors that there were. And then I think in your book you get into that a bit. And,
yes.
And you guys were speculating whether the highly literary early version of the pilot script might have been it's not important.
Right. And what I tried to do in the book, the book I've got out now, is try to get as much of the historical detail, the history from 1990, when the idea of Mulholland Drive, or 1991 was first, came about, all the way through to 2001 when it was released as a feature film, and even a little past that. But there was a co-writer that came on board briefly with Lynch. Joyce Eliason was her name, and I gave as much detail about that as I could find, and I found some. But ultimately, I don't think I mean, Joel might know more than I, but I don't think she contributed significantly to the final to the final script.
The backstory of this film is incredibly fascinating, and that was my favorite part of the book until I got to the next section, and I was pleased that I honestly was really pleased that each section sort of lived up to the previous section. I was wondering if the third section would feel a little flatter, even though it's interviews with cast members. But really, all sections of the book I feel were great, and so I'm curious if you would want to talk about either the backstory to the film or the backstory to your own writing of this book. Like, how long was it in the works mentally? Did you have, aside from the interviews, did you have a lot of notes written, etc.? You want to say just a couple of things about your own process?
Yeah, for sure. Well, back in the day, I did Wrapped in Plastic with Craig Miller, the magazine that basically was focused mostly on Twin Peaks, but also on any work that David Lynch or Mark Frost produced. So we did episode guides on Mark Frost television shows, and we did essays about David Lynch films. And so Mulholland Drive was a huge, huge deal when we first heard it was going to be a television show, because we were like, well, here's the next Twin Peaks. And I was commenting to my wife the other day, had Mulholland Drive become a television show, I think Wrapped in Plastic, the magazine, would have gone on years longer than it did, because it would have been this new, rich, territory for us to explore with episode guides and a lot of cast members to interview. But anyway, it ultimately, as I detail in the book, it became a film. And when the film was released, by that time, I think we had a reputation enough that we were able to get interviews with all the big actors. So we had the interviews with Naomi Watts, Justin Theroux, Laura Elena Herring. Those are the three main actors in Mulholland Drive. And those were published in Wrapped in Plastic. The Naomi Watts interview, that issue was probably the hardest to find issue of Wrapped in Plastic. It sold out and never went to reprint, and I've had more people ask about that issue than any other. And so I knew for these decades went by, and I knew I had these interviews, and I wanted to get them back in print. And I thought, oh, I could make a book maybe about Mulholland Drive, and these interviews will be a big chunk of that book, or a part of it. We wrote an in-depth essay about Mulholland Drive back in 2001, and Craig Miller was the main author on that. I contributed quite a bit to it, but he really was the person who wrote that, and so I could not. I just didn't. It wouldn't be right for me to reprint that. And so plus I read it again, and I was like, you know what? We were writing this sort of in the heat of the moment. Now that 20 plus years have gone by, I've kind of got a little distance from it. I like to reanalyze it. So I knew I was going to write a brand new essay, which turned out to be over 2 times as long as the essay that was in the magazine, which at that time was one of our longest pieces. So anyway, again, this is kind of boring stuff. I had the interviews. I knew I wanted to talk about the film. I also was very fortunate. I had seen the pilot, which few people had seen. And so I knew I had that source that will give me sort of an insight that few people have to the process of transforming it from one medium to another. And I did want to try to spell out as much of the history, because it's a fascinating story by itself, how Mulholland Drive transformed over the years. So all of those things, I wanted to put them all together, make a book, and that's what I did.
Was a lot of the book somewhat written in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think I knew the interviews were going to be at the end. I thought, well, you think for a while, well, maybe I should do like I did in my first book about Twin Peaks, the original series, where I had each episode, and then I had comments from the interviews we'd done over 15 years that interspersed about, about each episode. I thought, well, I could probably break up Mulholland Drive and then put commentary from the interviews. The problem with doing that is sometimes you lose portions of the interview because there's no other place to put them. And so I thought, these interviews are good. And we get into a lot of interesting things, particularly Justin Theroux and Naomi Watts. They get into more than the film. They really get into working in Hollywood and what it's like to be an actor. And I thought, okay, I want all those there. So I'm just going to put those as one big section of the book. So essentially the full interviews with some edits. And then I knew I wanted to do a history, and I knew I wanted to do a scene-by-scene analysis. So I kind of knew it kind of gelled. I kind of knew how it was going to go together before it even existed.
Talk to me.
If somebody were to sort of like boost this book, by just publicly telling other people to read it or whatever, say something nice, whatever. Who would be like a dream? You could dream as big or small as you want.
Well, there are names that would, you want like Fantasyland? David Lynch, we would never, ever read it or comment on it or acknowledge it. So, although he acknowledged Wrapped in Plastic, he acknowledged Craig Miller and me. So, I think he appreciated the work we did and our interest in his art. I don't know. Justin Theroux, probably. If you want to be someone who might say, he's still a well-known person, and if he came out and like, oh, I got this book. Cool. I honestly I've never thought of that. I've never really thought of what the answer to that would be. So
he comes across as very, very passionate artist, also a cool, pretty down-to-earth guy. As far as I could tell, just based on that one interview, I imagine that was enjoyable.
Yeah, Justin Theroux, he's been in a lot of things. I watched him very, very, very closely in Mulholland Drive. He is a brilliant actor. And he does all kinds of subtle little things that you can see that he's really, really inhabiting those characters. And I've watched him in other roles since then, and he's been in a lot of stuff. He's an actor that I think is overlooked too often. He's truly a great actor, and it was nice to have that interview with him getting into. It reflects a certain point in his career too, because it was 25 years ago, and a lot has happened to him since then. So he was sort of reacting to the beginning of a maybe a larger career that was coming to him. It's
really, really worth checking out. I highly recommend anyone who can get their hands on it, and they can.
Yes, they can.
A lot of people have talked about the backstory. At least a lot of David Lynch fans have talked about the backstory and the shifting from the early versions of Mulholland Drive, including the undefined early versions. Like, all right, we have a title, and then we'll see what we do with that. But how has your understanding of that shifting process from early versions to final film, how is your understanding, like, how does it differ from many or most other people's understanding? Because it's been discussed, but when I was reading about it, I read a lot of things that I hadn't seen before or heard.
Yeah, on the one level, of course, it's true of any project. An idea comes along, and then it maybe sits for a while, and then somebody returns to it, and it changes. They change their ideas about what it's going to be. I think that's true of a lot of films over the years. The film Alien, Aliens, sort of people are talking about a lot. If you look at the history of that film and how it was written, and it was going to be a B movie, and the guy who wrote it, they didn't like the script, but they loved that one chestburster scene, and then they were like, we're gonna take this, and it evolved. Much of the original script ended up ultimately in the film. because it was a great idea. And that's true of Mulholland Drive. Originally, Mulholland Drive was thought of as a spin-off of Twin Peaks. It was going to be another television series. It was going to feature the character Audrey Horne, and that's as far as Mark Frost and David Lynch really went with it. They were going to take Audrey out of Twin Peaks and move her to L.A. and she was going to have, noir adventures in L.A. And then it didn't really go anywhere. Lynch kind of went back and forth with it. It didn't really go anywhere. And then at a certain point, he through various people who knew him, he got ABC interested in it again, and they looked like they might be another television series called Mulholland Drive, to the extent that ABC was like, green lights the pilot. Lynch writes a script. They green light it, and he films the pilot. And so there's going to be a television series. Most people know this story. The television series never happened. The pilot was rejected by ABC. And then there's this 2-hour David Lynch film that's just sitting there, and it doesn't look like it's ever going to see the light of day. And then French investors come along and say, we think we can turn this into a film. And Lynch does, in fact, add new material to the end of the original pilot and makes it a film. But there is story there that is sometimes overlooked, and that is the fact that the Mulholland Drive pilot really was already self-contained. It was a finished work. It had an ending. An ending had been shot for it. It was called the European ending, just like there was a European ending for the Twin Peaks pilot. And it was completed. It actually had a conclusion to it. I think a lot of people overlook that because that was not satisfying to Lynch. Lynch was not happy ultimately with it, even though he was at one point, he was happy with it. When it was going to become a feature film, he was no longer happy with it. And so I try to explore why the finished pilot, again, self-contained work, wasn't satisfying to Lynch and why he had to add more to it. And I found some fascinating quotes from David Lynch that kind of open up his thought processes about how the film had to work. And so it took him a long time, and it took him a very short time. I mean, a year passed, I think, between when they knew they were going to make it into a film until it started shooting. He didn't know for a long time what he was going to do with it. To him, that finished pilot was not enough. And then suddenly he had an idea, and it all worked, and it all came together, and he found a way to add material and make it, to him, a satisfying, fully rendered film. And just briefly, I guess I'll go into it. I think I found quotes from Lynch where he talked about the difference between television and film. And for him, television was a very lightweight medium. It was something to have fun with. It was something to kind of explore and not necessarily know where you were going to go. But film for him has always been about character, has always been about the psychology of characters. And his finished Mulholland Drive pilot did not really have a satisfying underlying character that we could derive. We could say, why are these things happening? They're happening because they're happening. Lynch has been criticized throughout his career as someone who makes it up as he goes along, as someone who just, isn't interested. And that is completely false. And if anything proves that, it's Mulholland Drive. Had the Mulholland Drive pilot been released, then yes, maybe that criticism would be valid. He just sort of made it up as he went along. He admits that. But when he was going to make it a feature film and release it, he knew that there was something fundamentally missing in that pilot that he had to put in play. He had to establish a character underneath all of this. And he does that. He does that in the final film. He makes it about this woman named Diane Selwyn, and the pilot is her dream. And we find out all these real life events that happened to her that would have caused her to have that dream. And that is showing how Lynch very much is not just making it up as he's going along, that he has to find something that's satisfying and complete. And that's what the final Mulholland Drive is.
Pretty radically different, yes. The pilot idea with the closed ending or the original European ending to the final film, at least in terms of how you read the final. Pretty radically different, no? Is that an overstatement?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, I've seen the pilot, but I've never seen what he envisioned would have been the pilot with the closed ending. I think we can all we all have essentially, when we watch Mulholland Drive, we do see it. From what I was able to gather from research and talking to some really valuable sources, Mulholland Drive, the European closed ending, would have ended as we see almost all of it in the film, through Club Silencio, which is where the characters of Betty and Rita go to this club, and there's Rebecca Del Rio singing, and then there's the magician, and they find the blue box, and then Betty goes home and she disappears. There are some scenes that were probably going to be in the European ending that we don't see, and that is a scene with the detectives who are in a morgue and they are looking at the body who presumably, and again, I can't prove this definitively, was the character Rita Camilla, the brunette character, that she had died, and then it looks like the final European closed ending would have ended with the cowboy character opening a door into a bedroom and saying it's time to wake up. And that's how it would have ended. Now, if that's true, and I can't say for sure it is, although I have a lot of evidence, I think, to support it, what did it mean? Who was waking up? Oh, and do we know who was? Do we have any evidence to indicate who that might have been? And why was she dead? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so Lynch removed that one scene. He didn't have need for it. And he added in a very quick summary of the life of this woman named Diane Selwyn, who is also played by Naomi Watts, and the tragic life that she experienced in Hollywood. And that forms the basis of this mentality that would dream that dream.
Diane Selwyn, and forgive me for, I should probably know this, but is she in the pilot?
So the character's name, Diane Selwyn, is in the pilot. And Rita remembers the name, Diane Selwyn. It's just, maybe that's who I am. And they find a phone number and they call it. There's a fascinating line there where Betty, Naomi Watts, says it's weird to be calling yourself. And then they go to what they think is Diane Selwyn's apartment, and they find a dead body there. So that's as much as we know. Had we been in the pilot mode and not in the film mode, Diane Selwyn was likely a victim of some brutal thuggery, and that was a threat to the Rita character. Lynch shifts it all around, and he says Diane Selwyn is actually Naomi Watts, and she dreamed this. She created a new self called Betty. But the psychology of Diane Selwyn's dreaming mind is sort of fighting, saying this is all a dream. It's not real. There's sort of a part that wants to escape and a part that's guilty that's saying, no, we really can't escape from this. And so these violent real world happenings keep intruding upon the dream. And so that I would argue that is why they find this body, because the dreaming Diane Selwyn is aware that murder happened in her life, and so it manifests in that way in the dream.
Is Mulholland Drive? Tell me how accurate this is for the short summary, and I think it's not that accurate, but characters in a dream are searching for the dreamer. Is that at all accurate?
I would say a character in I mentioned, I think, in a footnote that that if we're looking at the first 2 hours of Mulholland Drive is the dream of Diane Selwyn, then everything we see in that dream is a manifestation of her psyche. So they're not, independent, autonomous beings. They're all part of her, ultimately her psyche. So one of the arguments I make is there is actually an arc, a story arc that's happening in that dream, in that it starts with her trying to escape, and then as the dream progresses, she's realizing I can't escape. I can't escape from what I've done, and so those begin those feelings of guilt and fear and real life events begin to creep into the dream. They start to manifest themselves as the dream progresses, and ultimately she realizes I can't run away from what I've done, and so then she wakes up.
I don't want to say too much, but I found it very interesting when you talked about the appearance of new characters in this film, and like they tend to show up during certain happenings. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Most, if not all of it, happens early in the dream, and so we see, this is all an editing choice on Lynch's part. So we see this character Rita, who's played by Laura Harring. Frequently, I think at least 3 times, she falls asleep in the story. Like she hides under a counter and she falls asleep. She's in the bedroom and she falls asleep. I can't remember, but anyway, every time that character falls into sleep, the story moves to the introduction of new characters. It's sort of this implication that the characters are dream entities, and you might argue, well, they're Rita's dream entities, which you could argue, and there'd be good ways to argue that, I suppose. I think Lynch had the footage he had, and he wanted to show this sort of sleeping, dreaming concept, and he used that. So she falls asleep right before the Winky scene. She falls asleep right before the detectives appear, and I think she falls asleep right before Joe the Hitman appears. So all those important sequences are bookended by her sleeping.
And so Joe the Hitman would probably be a real person from her life, and the detectives would be sort of conjured people in some way, and then Dan at Winky's would be a twist on a real person / stranger that she saw. So sometimes there's real people, sometimes there's twisted.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm trying to not stray too far from the fact that Lynch was, as he's constructing this, he's restricted to what he has to work with. He had the pilot to work with. And when he came back to shoot new material, he tried to show us, where some of these dream characters originated from in real life. Like the character of Dan was someone that Diane happens to see in the diner. The cowboy is someone she just happens to see pass by when she's at a Hollywood party. This figure walks down a hall. The character of Coco turns out to be Adam Kesher's mother. She never encounters detectives, but she knows that there are detectives. Her neighbor tells her there's detectives, plural, looking for you. So she has that idea running around in her mind, and it manifests. Maybe she creates who these detectives are. I do know, and I didn't write too much about this, but I will say it. I do know that Lynch wanted to show where some of the other characters originated, and had potentially another scene in mind that he could never get shot for various reasons. So we might have seen the real life version of Mr. Roque. We might have seen the real life version of Lainey, the prostitute that's on the street with Joe. We do see where Joe originates, how he came to be in the dream, the real life antecedent. So there are some characters in the dream that we don't ever see, and I think Lynch wanted to, but he had a very short period of time, and he could only get what he could get done.
is interesting. Would you say the pearl earring is kind of like to discuss the pearl earring is to kind of understand how the film works to some extent?
Yeah, I mean the pearl earring, it's funny because again, it's just a throwaway. You got to remember, had it been a television series, had the pilot gone on, the pearl earring would have been a clue that the detectives probably would have followed up. I mean, that's how the thread was going to go.
Yeah.
But Lynch, when he's restructuring it, now he's making it a film, he's like, well, why would this pearl earring be important? And so he establishes a scene where the pearl earring is crucially important. And that's the scene where Diane is at Adam Kesher's party and she's looking at Camilla and Camilla kisses this other woman. And when she does, she pulls her hair back, Camilla does, and shows the pearl earring. And that sears itself in Diane's mind. She sees that pearl earring and it manifests again in the dream. A number of things from that party will show up in the dream, and they happen so quickly in the party that you, even 3 or 4 viewing, I mean, there were things I hadn't known until I seen it like on my 4th or 5th while I was writing the book. I was like, oh, now I know why there's a guy named Luigi drinking a cup of coffee that he doesn't like. It all comes from the party. And so Lynch very, very efficiently, very deftly peppers that party with a bunch of things that stimuli. So there's stimuli that Diane absorbs that she then re-envisions in the dream. The coffee, Luigi, the pearl earring. There's other stuff. So
yeah, that's cool, and I like that the word pepper because I see that I see the cinematic chef and his pepper grinder, and that was an interesting phrase that you used. You Lynch's cinematic chef, at least in terms of this film. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, so I found these quotes from Lynch interviews in which he was talking about the pilot versus the film, and he referred to the pilot as I think he referred to it as a cake. And he said, well, I had this cake and it's a really beautiful cake. That's the pilot. And then he says, but then this cake has to be the main meal. So now the cake has to be a feature film. And for him, a feature film has to be more substantive. It has to, and he says in his quote, I'm throw some chicken and vegetables in. This meal starting to become healthy. So for him, the pilot was just dessert. The film was a meal that it had to be something important. And so I talk about how when he takes the pilot and transforms it into the film, he's acting like a chef who's adding new ingredients and instilling new flavors into the pilot and elevating it now to what he called the main meal. That's something that you could go and get more than a sugar high from. You would get something, nutritious from the film.
I got a real appreciation. I mean, I'm already a fan, but I got a real appreciation of David Lynch as an artist and a storyteller through this film, and specifically through your discussion of the film, and not just a matter of cleverness, but like you said, really elevating something that was. I'm sure it would have been a great TV show, but to turn that into like this meal, so to speak. I don't have anything really specific to say, but just as far as a storyteller, as a writer, as somebody who chooses details, and also as a problem solver, to turn that situation into the final product was really fascinating. One of the things that was changed was there's like a chain of phone calls in the film, and I know it was different. I think all the phone calls were initially in place, but you know more about that than me. But they took on a different meaning.
Yeah, I definitely I'll talk about that. But before I do, I just want to comment on what you said. I'm really pleased to hear you say that you were struck by Lynch as a storyteller, and that because I'm one of the few people. It's a fact. I mean, it just is. I was one of the few people who saw Mulholland Drive in the theater after having seen the 2-hour pilot. And and that's part of when I was writing the book, I'm realizing, oh, I didn't experience it like most people did. Most people went in and they saw this brand new film and they're trying to make sense of it. I went in knowing that what the pilot was going to be, and now I saw what it ended up as. And I remember coming out of the first time I saw it at the theater, and I saw it a number of times at the theater, coming out and just was. It was at that moment. I mean, I knew Lynch was a great filmmaker and I loved his work, but I was like, he's brilliant because
Yeah.
I've seen what he did. I see how he took this work and made it this other work. And if I have conveyed even the slightest bit of that feeling to you through my book, then I'm very happy, because that feeling was something I couldn't share with anyone. I wanted to tell people how brilliant this was,
Yeah.
but without that backstory, without that experience that I had, no one was going to get it really. I know if I like three people, and I'm not going to name names, but who saw the pilot and then saw the film. And when I meet those people again and I get a chance to chat with them, it's like we're like a tiny little club that we are like, oh, it was so amazing. But that was part of what I wanted to try to, it's praise of Lynch as being this person who could take this one work and make it this other work. And so I'm really pleased that some of that came through. I think maybe a lot of it did. But
Let me just quickly say, maybe a reluctant thank you to all the pains in the ass who didn't let him do things his own way the first time, because putting those roadblocks really created a whole new pathway.
yeah, I mean,
it would have been cool to have the TV show, but I don't know. I'm sure, like artistically or personally or imaginatively or in multiple ways, he had some sort of breakthrough and probably opened up a part of his own imagination and like storytelling prowess as a result of being denied, multiple times, and cracked down some walls for himself. I would imagine that we've all enjoyed ever since.
well, yeah, and I think Mulholland Drive is a success. I mean, there's no question about it. It was a critical success. I mean, he got an award at Cannes Film Festival. He was nominated for a Best Director award. It is considered by many critics one of the best films of the century so far. And I think a lot of David Lynch fans, and everyone has their favorite films, but I mean, it often ranks among fans as one of their top three, if not their favorite David Lynch film. So it is a success. I start the book with this sort of alternate reality. What might have happened had the pilot been picked up? We were close. I mean, ABC was, I think, thinking seriously about making this a television show. And what would have happened? Well, in all likelihood, there would have been a number of episodes, many of which, maybe most of which, were directed by Lynch, although I don't see how he could have sustained that. But again, I tried to go through this sort of thought experiment. What would have happened? There would have been this show. It would have had a number of episodes. It probably would have got canceled because it was weird. It wasn't your typical network fare. It was David Lynch. And so it would have probably been considered a failure or a cult show, or there's a number of shows that get canceled that are still to this day considered, there's a big fan base and people get together. Well, Twin Peaks, although no one expected what happened with Twin Peaks, that it would come back. But so really, ultimately, you're right. I mean, I think the film version of Mulholland Drive, if you could somehow see both realities, is a far greater success than the television version of Mulholland Drive likely would have been. So yeah, I think in a way, we're lucky that we get to celebrate it in that way, because and I mean, Naomi Watts, the act, plays Betty and plays Diane. She probably would have had some success on television. She might have been noticed for her work, but it wasn't until she was able to portray the Diane version of her characters that she was recognized as this talent. And she was nominated not for an Academy Award, but I think it was a Screen Actors Guild Award. She was catapulted, I think is the word I used, into sort of that rarefied air. And so that probably wouldn't have happened had it been a television show. So that's comment on that. I can comment on the phone calls if you still would like me to. Okay.
I'm sorry for taking us off.
No, I happy to talk about those other things. So yeah, there's a sequence of phone calls that we all know if we've seen the film. It happens. It sort of just happens out of the blue. There's this sequence of phone calls. It starts with Mr. Roke, whom we technically haven't really met yet, and he's the character played by Michael J. Anderson from Twin Peaks, and he says the girl is still missing. He calls someone, and he's almost like what I'm got on right now, and he says the girl is still missing, and then another character gets that message via a phone call, and then they essentially, send that message along to another phone, and then ultimately, the last phone in the chain of phone calls is the phone in Diane Selwyn's apartment. It's the phone that's in her bedroom or in her living room. It's Diane Selwyn's phone. That was not that way in the pilot. It did not end with that red lamp. It ended with this sort of modern device on a desk with a light. And it occurred to me when I was writing, this happened late in the writing, that we see something similar to that device in Twin Peaks: The Return. There's the character Lorraine sends us a message to Argentina, and there we see this device in a bowl or something with a blinking light receive the message. It's not exactly the same by any means, but it's similar to what the pilot had in it. And Lynch, of course, took that last device out, and he put Diane Selwyn's phone as the final phone in that chain, because Diane is essentially, in this dream, she's calling herself. The girl is still missing. She's summoning from her subconscious her avatar Betty. And so that last phone call on her phone rings, and that ringing noise echoes into the LA airport, and Betty comes out of the crowd as that ringing fades away. She has literally called herself into being, and as I say in the book, the girl is no longer missing. She's there. So to me, that's a lot of evidence to support the dream theory that Diane, as she's dreaming, needs to have an avatar in that dream, and she needs to have what she thinks is the perfect avatar, and so she dreams Betty Elms into existence.
Is there, sorry to digress, but is there a quote unquote perfect avatar in Twin Peaks?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a really good question, and I've never really I did a little bit in Ominous Whoosh talk about the character of Dale Cooper, and that Dale Cooper, as he appears late in Twin Peaks: The Return, episodes 16 and 17, is this idealized, perfect, superhuman detective. Yeah. And I compared him in Ominous Whoosh. I compared that version of Dale Cooper to Betty Elms, this sort of hyperbolic, impossible character. And I think it's possible, I've never explored this in any of my writings, but I've thought about it a lot, is that maybe Lynch sees this Dale Cooper from the original series, the television series, is sort of too good to be true, and in his mind can only be explained as an avatar of a dreaming mind. Potentially, there's a way of Lynch sort of reconciling these characters. I don't think that theory completely will hold together when you look at the whole narrative, but I'm not sure Lynch cares either. But I think that the Betty character, as she appeared in the pilot, that more was going to happen to her. But as she was going to appear in the film, she was an impossibility. And Lynch signals that impossibility both through the phone calls and then the old couple driving away after having just met her, cackling and laughing at what I say is the absurdity of Betty. She's not real. How could she be?
Okay.
That's what I write.
I'm picking my questions right now because I could go 4 directions. I'm going to read. Is 2 questions tied together. Is Laura Palmer a character in a dream? and and does and hold on, wait for part two. Wait for part two. Does Twin Peaks do the dream thing that Mulholland Drive does, except like differently by creating new faces to characters rather than new identities to existing faces?
All right, so I'm going to try
This
to
is just for fun.
sort of take the second part first. Twin Peaks is very complicated because obviously it's got multiple iterations that exist. I mean, unlike Mulholland Drive, the pilot technically doesn't exist. You can't watch the pilot, but you can go back and watch the first season of Twin Peaks and the second season of Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me and Twin Peaks: The Return. You can watch those, and those are explorations of the idea of Twin Peaks throughout time and through different, maybe a different creative approach or maybe a different mindset. The creator is more interested in looking at Twin Peaks this way than they were the other way, but they all exist, and we all, I think, try to reconcile how they fit together, which may be impossible and maybe not really worthwhile, because I think David Lynch and Mark Frost, when they were making Twin Peaks: The Return, were completely in a different place in their lives, and creatively they wanted to do something new with this existing work. And so in some ways Twin Peaks: The Return is only notionally connected to the original Twin Peaks. And in some ways it's a commentary on that, which just gets back to the Dale Cooper character to some extent. Through Twin Peaks: The Return, they're making a commentary on what this other work was. So there's that. It's very complicated, and it's part of the reason why there's such a fervent fan base about Twin Peaks and so much written about it. Because it's this organic, it evolved, it changed, it became different as it went along. Mulholland Drive ultimately was a problem to be solved. I mean, it is in so many ways it's different than anything Lynch has done, because when Lynch sits down to make a film, making it sound like it's just an everyday occurrence, but when he conceives of a film, I think when he starts shooting it, he basically knows where it's going to go. Again, he's not making it up as he goes along. He has a full conception of what it is, why each scene functions the way it does, what it ultimately leads to at the end. If you can't make sense of it, that's okay, but he had a sensibility behind it. When he made Mulholland Drive pilot, he had one sensibility at work. And when he made the Mulholland Drive film, he had another one. He had to fit these two things together. And so it was a problem to be solved. And I didn't write this, I almost did in the book. I think you could look at Mulholland Drive almost like a Rosetta Stone to Lynch's work. It's a way of us seeing his creative approach because here we almost see it overtly, the idea of character psychology underlying what we're seeing. There's so many things in Lynch's films that I think people take literally, which may not be literal. All the way back to Eraserhead. There's a scene in Eraserhead where I think Henry opens the door and he sees the woman across the hallway, whom he kind of is attracted to and he fantasizes about. And she looks at him. I can't remember exactly, but is that literally happening, or is he imagining that? I think she comes in. Yeah, she comes in and then gets into bed with him. Well, I would argue that that's not really happening. That's he's imagining that. But we see it play out on screen. And so that's Lynch's approach. And I think Mulholland Drive lets us see it a little more, maybe a little more clearly. This is how he is satisfied. This is how he wants to make his film. He wants to be about the mind of a character and the problems that psyche is feeling, the obstacles that they're encountering. They're in the way of themselves. And Mulholland Drive lets us see that more clearly maybe than other films do.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And that was the experience I had while reading this book. But reading this book was interesting in itself, but it all, of course, well, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but it throws my mind back into Twin Peaks. It throws my mind into Lost Highway. into Inland Empire, which we might touch upon later. But yeah, I see what you mean as like sort of a Rosetta Stone that gives you maybe at least through your book, maybe a clear sort of view of the template. Although it's not just template stuff that he's doing, but does Mulholland Drive and The Return, Twin Peaks: The Return, do they speak to each other for you at all? More now, if at all, more so after writing the book, or no different?
Um, maybe a little bit. Again, Mulholland Drive is just simple. I think. I mean, I'm trying to put down anyway. It's my favorite Lynch film. I love Mulholland Drive. I love almost everything about it. And in fact, I think the Club Silencio scene may be my all-time favorite Lynch sequence when they go and the magician is there and Rebecca Del Rio singing. I was fortunate to see it on the big screen last year, and Rebecca Del Rio was there, and she was sitting, down in the lobby of the theater when I came out, and I went up to her and I was just like, you're part of one of the most brilliant cinematic events of all time, and I love it. Uh, I think Twin Peaks: The Return is more complicated. I do think it gets into the idea of what's literal and what's psychological, and exploring what we want to see versus what is real, and trying to cope with reality. There's a lot of that. I get into some of that in my book.
Also, everything you just said also describes Mulholland Drive as well. Yeah.
Right. So I will say this. It's interesting because, again, I had the advantage of seeing the pilot.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see the film, Mulholland Drive, when it came out in 2001. Craig and I talked about it a lot, and we were like, it's a dream. He recontextualized the pilot, which we saw, as a dream. And then we sort of struck us. Well, he did that in Twin Peaks. He took the European ending of the pilot of Twin Peaks, took the last 10 or 15 minutes, and it became Dale Cooper's dream in the second hour-long episode of Twin Peaks. He took something he shot and he made it a dream. And it was at that point that I wrote, or I sort of struck me like, wait a minute, the first 30 minutes of Fire Walk with Me, which he shot in a way he did not initially intend. It was supposed to be Kyle MacLachlan playing Dale Cooper in that entire 30 minutes, but MacLachlan couldn't do it or wouldn't do it, and they brought in another. Anyway, there's a lot of that at the time we were struggling with. Well, how does this fit with the rest of the film? Does it make any sense? And then I thought, well, it's a dream. It's Dale Cooper's dream. And I wrote an essay, and it's a long story. Some people liked it, some people hated it. But for me, it was like a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, well, what if Dale Cooper is there in Fire Walk with Me all that time? And this is just how he's imagining it. It makes him a more substantive character, and he needs to be in that film. It sort of makes the film suddenly cohere in a way that it seemed disjointed before. And for me, it was sort of definitive. I was like, yes, this, for me, it works. And then you get this approach to Mulholland Drive, which is hard, for me anyway. It's hard for me to see it another way. You certainly can interpret Mulholland Drive in different ways, but I know what was what. I know what he had, the problem he had to solve, and what the ultimate solution was. So it sort of clarified certain elements of Lynch works that seemed maybe mystifying to me in the past. And when I went to see Inland Empire, which I can't give you a definitive explanation for, but I do feel like there's a psychology involved there. There's certainly, there is a character, whether we see her on screen or not. Much of what we're seeing is the result of her life and her. Maybe it's a dream, maybe it's her vision. I don't know. And when Twin Peaks: The Return came out, I was in the mindset that we were going to be seeing the psychology at play. I didn't know how, and I didn't know how much. And I think that that's what we did see in that show.
Rebecca Del Rio's character was supposed to be a bit of a drunk initially. collapsing from drunkenness, and so much better the way it turned out, or at least in terms of your sort of interpretation of her falling down, which we don't have to get into right now. But does she and Julie Cruz, do they share anything? And I'm not trying to stretch to make connections between these two texts, but does her character and Julie Cruz's character, do they share like a function? Do they serve a certain role?
It's not just Julie Cruz. It's also I just had the name and it went out of my head.
And actually, I'm sorry, John. I'm gonna just.
Okay. Now it's okay.
Yeah,
good.
Sorry for that. Thank you.
No, that's fine. I want to make sure you.
Julie Cruz and Rebecca Del Rio, perhaps another.
Yeah. So I mentioned briefly in the book, talk about Rebecca Del Rio, and I actually had a quote from another scholar where Rebecca Del Rio, but other singers like Julie Cruz and Jimmy Scott, who was at the end of Twin Peaks, convey what quote a pure cinematic expression of sorrow and loss, end quote. And I also added into that Eddie Vedder, who is in the Return is Edward Louis Severson, sings Out of Sand when Audrey comes into the roadhouse. And there are other, I'm sure, we could go back and look at the appearance of other singers. There's a lot of singers in Twin Peaks The Return, although they're basically just up on the stage. But occasionally they're sort of intersecting the story, which was the case with Audrey. And I think Lynch, sees those powerful performances as sort of maybe a shorthand, but that's sort of a dismissive way. I don't mean to dismiss it. There's sort of a way of getting sort of condensing some emotion and some feeling very quickly. And the Rebecca Del Rio portion is so crucial. I mean, it's a turning point in many respects to Diane's mentality. She's already kind of accepted that she's close to waking up and she's going to have to, atone or deal with what things that's happened. But it's that song that it's after that song. I mean, Diane and Rita both or Betty and Rita both are crying, and it's then that Betty finds the blue box in her purse. It's almost as if the song manifested the box, or the song was the portal through which her mind had to pass in order for the box to make quote unquote a physical appearance. So songs and music and performances are, I think, really important to Lynch.
Was Rebecca Del Rio's character a somebody like trying to tap the real person on the shoulder or something, or sort of expressing something that broke down a door or something? Or?
I'm not sure it was designed that way initially. I mean, the story, Rebecca Del Rio tells the story, and I try to cover it in the history part of the book, is that someone contacted Lynch and said, I've got this great singer, I think you should hear her. She comes to the music studio. He says, why don't you sing something? She goes into the sound booth, she sings Llorando, and they record it. And that's the recording that they actually use in the film, because it was so powerful, it was so strong, that Lynch was sort of blown away by it. And I think he figured, I've got to get her. He finds a way, to now, the Club Silencio sequence was, again, initially was going to be just sort of poetic ending to the pilot, and the meaning of that ending was certainly ambiguous and open to interpretation. Ultimately, I think it serves a crucial transitional function in the story. It's essentially the second act of Mulholland Drive. We have a dream. It's still part of the dream, but it's sort of in that weird phase between, I would argue, mentally, waking up stage, where she's half awake, maybe. Or and I embrace this interpretation too. It is something supernatural or spiritual or beyond the forensic reality of day to day that is intruding upon her life. So I think that that's a legitimate way of looking at that sequence. I think Rebecca Del Rio just fit there perfectly for him. I think he was like, yeah, we need to have this. It's a powerful emotion, is all he really wanted in that scene, I think, initially. Powerful emotions, reactions, responses, tear away the logic or the progression of plot and just get at whoever the character is.
Do you have any observations that you made in this book, or perhaps even not in this book, about Mulholland Drive that you're particularly pleased with, confident with, or the inverse? Anything that you're like not so less confident about, or so either way.
Yeah, I mean, well, a couple of things. First of all, real quick, and I talk about this in the book. Apparently, or not apparently, it's definitively. I've got it in front of me. When Mulholland Drive was released to home video, Lynch supplied 10 clues to deciphering the film, which I feel like I was able to answer with some confidence. Almost all of them. And essentially all of them, which made me feel pretty good. Before I started the book, when I read those clues, I'd be like, I'm not sure what that is or what that means. But anyway, I won't go into all the details on them necessarily. But beyond that, there were two things that I was very pleased with. Ultimately, I didn't know I was going to find out or arrive at. The first is, Mulholland Drive, according to sources, Chris Rodley, who wrote Lynch on Lynch, I mean, he says specifically that Lynch divides, he saw it on Lynch's desk or something, that Lynch divides Mulholland Drive into 3 acts. She found herself inside a perfect mystery is Act 1, and what's Act 2? I can't remember. The Act 3 is love, and hang on, I'm sorry.
There, love.
Yeah, sorry, I'm doing this too. A Sad Illusion is Act 2. So she found herself inside a perfect mystery is Act 1. That's most of the 2 hours. A Sad Illusion is Act 2, which is Club Silencio, and makes sense. It's all an illusion, and it's sad because they're crying. But the Act 3 is called Love. And I watched some interviews with Lynch too, where he said, it's a love story. It's about love. I was just like, that doesn't make any sense to me, because I don't see love in the story. I see people thinking what love might be, or pretending what love might be, but I don't see it. And I found a Lynch quote in a very obscure place, and in one of his lithograph art books, there was an interview where he talked about love and about how, maybe love isn't what we think it is. And I thought, oh, okay, there's Lynch talking about love. And I think that's, I think the quote, I'm going to get it wrong, and I could look it up, but I won't bother. We project it, or we make it into something that we want it to be when it isn't. And that was like, that's Act 3. That is what's happening here, is that Diane thought she was in love, but she didn't really know what love was. She thought she was in love with Camilla, but she couldn't see that she was either infatuated or obsessed with Camilla. She either didn't have enough life experience, or she just didn't know. And so I wrote a little bit about that. I felt like that was sort of an important piece that needed to be addressed, is do we take Lynch at his word that this is about love? Because if we do, what's he thinking? so I wanted to do that, and I felt really good about exploring that, and again finding that Lynch quote. And then when he gets right down to parts of the plot, One of the things that sort of happened again, one of those things that happened in the moment, or at least after some thought, I was struggling with at the very end of the film. Joe, the hitman, says to Diane, "When it's done, you'll find this," and he holds up the blue key. "You'll find this where I told you. This is the signal." And Diane essentially hijacks our thought processes at that point, although we may all be thinking sort of that way when we see a key, is what's it open?
Yeah.
What she says, "What's it open?" And then he laughs, and that he laughs at her, and the laugh fades and dissolves into the demonic bum-like figure behind the diner holding the blue box. And maybe it's not a big revelation, but I thought about it for a while. What is happening here? Why would he be laughing at her? And why are we dissolving? And I realized, oh, the key is not a symbol for opening. The key is a symbol for locking. The key is a symbol for closing something up. And she just, in that moment, she essentially sold her soul away by committing to having another person killed. And so when she asks, "What's it open?" he's mocking her in many ways, laughing. You don't get it at all, which is really Diane Selwyn. You don't get what love is, and you don't get what in some ways she's a tragic figure, but I mean she was lucky. She won a contest and she inherited a bunch of money, and so she got to go do this thing, but not necessarily because she had the talent or the drive or the commitment to doing it. And so she really isn't someone who's had to work hard or experience these things. And so she sees the key and she says, "What's it open?" And for me, that was a big revelation, is, it doesn't open anything. She just locked herself away. So that I was very happy with that.
Yeah, I would say rightly so. And I have on my screen here a question that I had written in advance, and it says, "Is there a message for the rest of us in Diane's story?"
Well, she's this very specific character. I think what I just said is that I think we appreciate where we are in life and the things that we have in life, because we've had to work at it, or we've had to go, we've had to put some time into getting it. Again, as I said, she's a character who it just happened for her, and she thought because she could dance well, she could be a great actress. And she thought because someone was paying attention to her that, oh, this must be what love is. But she was naive. And so, yeah, I think it's a cautionary tale in that respect. So
I thought there was an empathy as I got to the closing parts of your analysis. I felt empathy for the character, and also felt some of the opposite toward the Herring character. I never know what name to call her, to be quite honest. But
Camilla. Yeah. That was actually another that was another thing I hadn't really seen clearly until after really studying the film. There's a scene where Camilla leads Diane up through the woods to the party at Kesher's house. They come in to the backyard of the pool, and Kesher comes out with wine or champagne, and he gives it to them, and he says, "Here's to love." And then Coco, Adam Kesher's mother, comes out, and she says, "There she is. Let's eat. I'm starving." And I guess for a long time I read that as Coco was mad at Diane. And then I realized, oh, Diane is playing a game here. I'm sorry, Camilla is playing a game here. That Camilla, so many names. Coco is mad at Camilla. Camilla went down the path and disappeared, and Coco wanted to have dinner, and where's Camilla? And then Camilla's back, and Coco's mad at Camilla. There she is. Let's eat. I'm starving. And Camilla kind of transfers that um, that
Disdain, maybe.
disdain toward Diane. Diane takes it on. Like she says, I'm sorry I was late. She thinks she's to blame. She's not. It was part of, again, Camilla messing with her. And then you find out in the dinner, Coco, so there's one of David Lynch's clues to solving the film is, did talent alone help Camilla? And you realize, oh no, she's a manipulator. Maybe she's sleeping her way to the top, and you see that in Coco. When Diane says, I met her and then she helped me get some part, Coco says, I see. She knows exactly what's happening. And then later, there's very quickly after that, there's something where Kesher's going to announce that they're getting married, and Coco just gives a just disgusted look at it. Coco's not a bad character. I used to think that she was this sort of snobbish Hollywood matron who did look down on Diane, and then I realized, oh, she doesn't like Camilla. And I'm not sure this is answering your question of going off on this one particular tangent, but it was stuff like that that helped me see more of the nuance in what was going on in some of these characters.
Yeah, that did answer my question, and then some. And I want to ask you a question about you. Do you feel like you're part of two communities, or maybe more? Like, for instance, like the sort of somewhat part of the fandom community, but also part of academia in some sense, because your work is scholarly. There's like 5 pages courses, and you speak in that language a lot, but you kind of move back and forth between the two, it seems. I don't know if this is a conscious thought you have, but
A very conscious thought. I mean, when we were doing Wrapped in Plastic, and I think I may have talked to you about this before. So, you can remind me if I have, but I like reading analyses of films, and I like reading scholarly work that helps me see films or television or any art in ways I might have missed. Or we don't all have time to spend a year watching Mulholland Drive, and so I like, read something and it's like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Now I think of it a different way. This is really opened. It made the work even more interesting to me than it did beforehand. And I'm sure I talked to you about, because I know we talked about that Inland Empire essay at one point. See, sometimes you read some academic essays that are just impenetrable. It's like, well, I don't really know, why are they using all this jargon and these complicated sentences? I mean, it's not like I can't read sophisticated writing, but they're obscuring the point sometimes. And so when we were doing Wrapped in Plastic, I would say to Craig, you know what, I want to write to if I can, I don't know if I can, to a rigorous scholarly level where I've researched stuff, or I can back up an argument, or I can, I can source it, but I don't want to make it unreadable. I want to make it so that fans can sort of enjoy the work again or relive it, and so definitely try to think, I want to make it readable. I mean, that's why I opened it with like, oh, it's an alternate reality. There's another reality. There's a television show. Should hopefully, be interesting to read. But I want it to be more than just my opinion. I kind of back it up and why it works that way. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but it is definitely on my mind to try to do it that way.
is there like a sort of film scholar community out there, or a film academia community out there? And if so, are you a part of it?
I don't think so. I've been invited to contribute to some more scholarly works. A lot of that scholarly stuff. I mean, basically, they want you, if you're a professor at a university and you're writing. I think they're more interested in that than I would consider myself an amateur. But I've been writing about David Lynch and Twin Peaks for decades. And so I think some people know, oh, he's put the time in and he knows a little bit about, I've interviewed a lot of people and I've read a lot and I've studied it. So, I hope it comes across that it's not just, this is how I feel. Because there's only so far you can go with, I really liked it. It made me feel great. I loved it. Oh, I'm sad now. There is a lot of that out there. And there's some value to it, but I think lasting value is something that, someone can come and look at a book like this, I hope, 30 years from now and say, oh, okay. Oh, I see. This is where the ground is, the foundation of the argument. And I can look at this film now and this is going to give me some insight that I might not have gotten anywhere else.
Do you have like a long, I know the book is already written and published, but do you have a long-term goal for the book or short term?
Or
Impact or how it's received or feedback or anything like that?
Well, obviously, I mean, you want people to like it. You hope people get something. It's only been a few weeks really since the book. I mean, and we're talking August 28th. So it's been 3 weeks, 3 weeks since the book's been out. So, I've gotten a few responses online through Twitter and other places. People are like, "Oh, I'm really glad I got it, and I'm looking forward to reading it." Or, I watched the movie. I did have. I hope he doesn't mind me saying, but I'm going to say it. So Jeff Jensen, who he used to write for Entertainment Weekly, and he's written for television. He co-wrote, or helped. He was story editor and one of the writers on Watchmen with Damon Lindelof. He sent me a message and he said, "I'm watching the film as I read your book." Well, like, that's great. And then he sent me another message when he was done, and he was very complimentary. And I mean, that's great. So if that's all I get, that's fine. I mean, I don't know. I guess I do hope that the film's 25 years old. A lot of people have seen it. A lot of people will see it. It's one of those movies that's always going to be around, and I hope I can contribute to appreciating it for audiences. I hope 20 years from now somebody will still want to buy it and like find out something about it. I mean, again, I was very, very lucky too. I was able to interview the actors at the time of the film's release. They were unguarded at the time, and so I mean that's the second third of the book. And I think there's great value there too. And getting some insight from the people who were involved. And when we I say this in the book, when we conducted those interviews, so much on our mind was the fact that it had been a pilot, that it was supposed to be a television show, and then it became a film. And then that informs so much of our interviews with those actors. We're asking them, what was like to be involved with the David Lynch project, to see maybe it wasn't going to happen, then have it come back to life, then have it be celebrated. And so I don't think you could conduct that interview now with them. I mean, you could ask them about those things, but it's 25 years in their past. When we asked them, it was literally had only been a year since they shot the new material for the film. So I think there's a great value there in the book to those interviews.
I'm going to ask you to do a little tiny bit of teaching, I think. Not professorship, but distance teaching. One approach that you used in this book, which I believe you used for part of your ominous whoosh analysis, and just in case anybody has anything to refer to that book, there we go. And then we got
the trilogy.
There's the Thorne trilogy, but you used ideas from narrative theory, specifically a scholar named Seymour Chapman, and I think some other satellite figures within narratology or narrative theory. I know very little about it aside from what you and I have talked about, but I am an English teacher at the middle school level, and I teach high school as well, like tutoring and a little college here and there. And I was just wondering if you can give a 3 to 5 minute guest lecture impromptu about the concept of narrative theory. But can I just say one little starting point? I have already taught my class that there's story and there's discourse. And one thing you might look at when you're looking at the story is something that might be called like kernels versus satellites. And I'm not sure if that's a term that is history. But kernels, as I understand it, is essentially like the most important elements of a story. And if you take them out, the story
Right.
part. Whereas satellites are maybe more texture, maybe more mood, maybe
Yeah.
more vibe. Like, so I imagine David Lynch cutting a 2 hour movie to 88 minutes had to try to keep the kernels, but lose a lot of these, not the soul, lose a lot of the satellites. So let's say my students have heard those words before, but really nothing else. What can you give us?
You know, that is a great example, and I had never thought of that before. But what happened? I'm going to use this specific example, so I'll try to talk about the idea of it. What happened to David Lynch when the ABC network said we want to air this pilot, but we don't like the length of it. It's too long, and there's parts of it that we don't think really contribute to the story. We want you to take these things out. One of them was we want to take out any character who only appears once in the story. So if a character appears more than once, you can leave them in. The character only wants to take them out. So Lynch does this with reluctance. He does not want to do it, but he wants to get the show on. He wants those actors to work, and he wants to tell his story. So he makes the edits that the network has asked. And what happens was, essentially, you're right. He kept the kernels, but he took away the satellites. And the satellites are these embellishments, these added pieces that in a long form story may blossom later. They're kernels, and they could in fact pop or open up later in a longer story. Or they might be able to somehow, what's the word I'm looking for? Contribute to other parts of the story by comparison or contrasting what might be happening to another character versus what's happening to the main character. And you could sort of see, you could glean something from these other events, even if they don't directly affect the main character. So what you're doing is, it's like in a painting, it's a painting. I'm not a painter, and maybe this is a bad analogy, but I'm going to try it anyway. If I want to paint to you a man fishing off of a boat, well, so basically I need the boat and probably the water, not necessarily, but the boat and the man in the boat with a fishing rod. But there's not a lot there. But if I decide to paint the sky in as gray, and maybe there's some storm clouds, and I decide to, add change the way he's dressed, you start to see into the picture more than just the man on the boat fishing. You start to see, oh, he might be threatened by weather, or he's not dressed very well, or he's dressed very well. Why is he in that boat? I mean, it raises questions. It asks you, the viewer or the observer, to ask questions, to participate in some way. A man in a boat fishing, there's not much I can add to that. I see it. But if you show me these other things, then I'm going to have some questions, or I might speculate, or I might just start thinking in ways I didn't expect to, or nobody else will. This is that transaction that happens, that that relationship where the viewer, the observer, becomes part of the art. And that, I think, is where the magic happens, where we connect with something. Why are certain films so important to us? Why are certain books so important to us? Because something happened, and you can't really necessarily say specifically what it was. But without those satellites and that texture, that connection is less likely to happen. How's that?
Great, great. But we have not. But my class has only been told the word discourse, but we haven't really gone into it. So there's story and there's discourse. And if one wanted to analyze a text by focusing more on discourse than story, or how discourse affects the story, what sort of tips can you give us?
So, what an interesting experiment might be to list out 4 or 5 facts that are a story. There's this character, he went here, he did this. And then ask people to tell that story and see whether or not he dies at the end. That would be adding more to the story. You'd have to expand it. I'm thinking out loud here, so I don't really know, but you can tell that story out of order. You can tell that story from different, a narrator could be telling it, or an omniscient narrator, first person narrator could be telling it. So there's different ways to convey that story, and that's where that's where the artistry comes from. That's where you see the expression of somebody's individuality come from. I've given you some facts. Make me interested in it. Tell it to me some way that's gonna make me want to keep listening to your story. And that's what discourse does. That's what discourse does. So we've all gone to movies where we see the last scene first. And then the question is, how do we get to this scene? That stays with us as we're watching the entire film. Wait a minute. We know that guy is going to end up on that truck at the end. But how? And so now we're engaged in a way that we might not be, but we could tell the story. Sunset Boulevard is David Lynch's favorite film. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I don't want to ruin anything, but it starts with a dead body in a pool, and that character is narrating the story. And so you are immediately got questions,
Yeah.
And that's a choice by the director to tell the story a certain way. And it allows you to tell it in ways you couldn't there's other ways. It gives you certain options. And anyway, again, I'm really thinking out loud here, but I think it allows you to artistically explore. Discourse does. So that might be an experiment you might try with some of your older students, or maybe the younger ones too.
Yeah.
Tell me the story in a way that's going to make me want to keep listening to it.
That's awesome. I'm going to actually try that with kids when they're in the mood to spend time with me. So I'm going to wait.
Okay.
Little fun contest. And yeah, that's neat. And David Lynch is certainly great at telling the story in a way that gives us, the viewers, a lot of room to dream, which is one of his famous phrases. How would you explain that phrase if you had to?
Well, I think it's what a lot of what I was saying earlier is this where he's asking, and I wrote about this in Ominous Wish, he's asking the viewer to participate in the art, and he is not concerned about whether or not you're going to come up with something that he never thought of. And Mark Frost says this too in a quote where he says, if somebody sees something in your art that you didn't intend, then it's there for them. You can't go to that person and say no. The artist doesn't have that right, really. I think some artists maybe try to do that, and I think they don't understand, or it maybe shows a less sophistication on their part, because the artist can't say no, you're wrong to somebody who's watching it. Maybe on a very general level, you could say, well, that guy didn't get killed. Well, yeah, he did. He got killed. It's pretty obvious. So you could correct them in that way. But Mark Frost says, you know, if somebody sees it in your art and you didn't intend it, then it's there for them. And so I think that's room to dream is. Lynch and other great artists too. He's not the only one by any means. Frost is this way too. Um, Tells you a story and gives you the room to come into it as well and engage with it. So I think that's what it is.
Yeah, very cool. And lastly, if you're having a difficult time deducing what is happening in a story, just piecing together the plot or rearranging it or whatnot, would you recommend turning to looking at the discourse as a means to sort of untangling the plot? Is that something you do or have done, or is there like another bit of advice you might ask or you might offer to somebody who's trying to untangle a difficult plot?
Watching something again, that's a big ask too. There was something, it's funny, I can't remember what it was. It was something I saw recently and it didn't work for me, but it was like a significant film, or I forget what it was.
Yeah.
And I knew that, I mean, this film had a history to it. I'm like, okay, well, I'm missing something, or I'm not in the right frame of mind. I mean, I've gone back to movies that I didn't maybe like the first time, and then have a new appreciation for it. Or I do this book club every month at this local bookstore where we read one of the BFI. There's a series of books, BFI, British Film Institute, does these short books where they analyze a film.
Hmm.
And we see the film, we read the book, and we go in and we talk about it. And there have been a number of films, I shouldn't say a couple of films that I was ambivalent about. And then I read the book and I'm like, oh, okay, I have a different appreciation for it. I didn't know some of this, or I didn't see that. I didn't see that, that approach the director was taking. And so then I'm less critical of it, or, I'm less dismissive of it. Let's put it that way. So, I mean, but that, again, I understand too that you can't, people don't have time to go and see a film over and over, especially if they didn't like it the first time. So I guess when there is a film I'm watching and I don't care for it, or maybe I'm confused by it, I do try to try to make some, see what is the director trying to do here. So I guess that's discourse. Then I am thinking in the moments like, okay, I don't really care about the story, but why is the director telling it to me this way? Why am I not engaged with it? And I do try to think about it on a different level to see if I can figure myself out. But I mean, again, we don't all have the luxury of you see a lot of people that will go to a movie like, I didn't like that movie. Like, well, okay, that's fair. You didn't like that movie, but Mad Max Fury Road is a great example. Okay, I love Mad Max Fury. I think maybe one of the greatest films ever made. I truly believe that it is brilliant. Every time I watch it, I see something new in it. But I know a lot of people who went and saw it and was like, I was stupid, or that was their reaction to. Didn't give them what they wanted. It was supposed to be an action film, and Mad Max was the secondary character, and he didn't do as much as I want. Whatever, right? You can't convince them. You say, but well, look, it was doing some things that really were fascinating, and it was so brilliantly made. So
Yeah.
oh well, you hope someone will rediscover it, right?
And to each his own,
Right.
Yeah, I had that experience with a couple of films, but and I'm Italian and I wanted to like them. So La Ventura was one, and
Okay.
Journey to Italy, but no big deal. I just didn't enjoy them, but I knew other people did, so I tried to find out,
Right.
But is there anybody that in your research for this book, any sources that you found particularly fruitful, either in terms of how they countered your own opinion or just how they sparked your thinking in some new way?
Well, I would always say this isn't academic stuff, but I found David Lynch interviews, which were really interesting. So you dig deep if you're looking, sometimes they're not the obvious ones. But there is a book of essays on Mulholland Drive. There's only one. It's in the bibliography. It's called Mulholland Drive. That's just the name of it. And there's like 6 essays in there. Some of them I loved, and some of them I honestly was like, oh, this is not working for me. There's been a lot written about Mulholland Drive. So I would say George Toll's essay. It's not in that book I just mentioned. It was in Film Comment, and he unpacks the Betty audition scene. That is an amazing, amazing.
There it is.
Yeah. I know it's in Film Comment, and I know that he also reprinted it in a book of essays that he wrote. I don't have that book. I have the original Film Comment, which may be available online. I don't know. That is just, it's so interesting. It's just, how he goes in and I tried to kind of do a little of that. I was going somewhere else with it, but he did a great job there. There in the bibliography, there's some essays in there. I guess I can't tell you which ones were the really good ones, but there are some good writing about Mulholland Drive out there.
Do you have any people you admire or any heroes as far as writers go, specifically people who write about film or TV?
It's I don't really have a film. I don't have anyone in particular that I go to like, oh, they're writing about film. So it's just a mix of. There's a lot of people who write really well about film, academic essays. When you pick up like that Mulholland Drive book, some of them. I think the Robert Sinnerbrink essay, and then there was a couple that wrote. It was two authors that wrote about Mulholland Drive. So I mean that's a very specific example. I mean there's a nonfiction writer out there who's really written about one topic, and it has nothing to do with film, and that is the writer Robert Caro, who is written 4 books about Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the biography of the President Johnson. The 5th book is supposed to come out any year now. It's been 11 years since the last volume. He's a great writer. I had no real interest in LBJ, but the writing was so good.
Yeah.
The research. He is somewhat. I've read the essays that he's written about researching. And it's somebody to model yourself after. It's like, oh, this is somebody who is going to turn every page, is going to, he's going to go to every source they can. And while I certainly did not, I tried to go to a lot. So when I was writing this book, the first step after watching it again was to read a lot about Mulholland Drive. I read a lot of essays and took notes just to see what some of the other thinking was out there. And I got that sort of philosophy from Robert Caro. So.
Is there a question that you want me to ask? In the context?
In the context of?
This conversation.
Oh, gosh. You've asked some really good questions so far, so I can't think of offhand anything. I'm sorry. Again, you were.
How do you pronounce the word geocaching?
Oh, geocaching?
Yeah.
That's it. Geocaching. Caching as in like cash money, but it's spelled CACHE, caching. Why do you ask about that?
If that was a topic you had any interest in explaining for maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
I have a friend who wants to write a book about geocaching. He wants to write it with me, so I don't know if that'll ever happen. I he's got some incredible story because he's traveled all over the world. And in fact, last year he and I and a couple of other people drove. We flew to Alaska and then we drove to the Arctic Circle to get a geocache. It's a long story, but we did that. It took us I don't know, it took us 4 days of driving to get to it. But we did it. Geocaching is a hobby slash sport that people do where it's like a treasure hunt. You can go on to geocaching.com and find out about it. People hide things all over the place, little containers, big containers. And you get the coordinates and you got to go try to find it. And when you find it, you sign a little piece of paper that you found it. Around the city, there's some in parking lots. They're real easy. They're in a bush next to a mailbox or something. And there's really, really hard ones and remote ones. So I'm actually wearing a shirt that says Canyonlands National Park. And I went with this friend there and we drove 5 hours in and 5 hours back in 4-wheel drive vehicles to get to this one geocache. That's the kind of stuff I like to do. So I've gone at some really remote spots and, try to it's fun. It's a way of seeing the world and it's like a hobby. So
and
you don't have to do it that way. If people are like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to do that. You can do it with your kids. That's how I started. You go to a local park where they have a play set and somebody's hidden something in, the fence. It's just hanging on the fence or something, or it's magnetized to the fence. And the kids love it because it's like a treasure hunt and it's very easy and it's safe and it's fun. But if you want to take it to an extreme, you can do that too.
Very neat. And is this part of the same personality that you have? The desire to explore and investigate and find and pursue court in the world?
Yeah, I think they're actually very much different.
Okay.
I do. I think one is gets you out of the house. It's like going on a vacation. It's clearing your mind. It's both a puzzle. I mean, yeah, I can see how there might be some similarity there, but it's a physical thing more than a mental thing, although there's there's puzzle caches, which you have to figure out the puzzle to, sometimes it's codes and ciphers and all that kind of stuff. But I have a different mentality when it comes to the writing. I mean, that's really, I'm sitting at the table and I'm not moving versus I'm in a Jeep driving 100 miles into so
Glad I asked you because you once mentioned it for maybe 30 seconds just as a side comment while we were in the middle of discussing I think we were discussing the missing pieces for your Ominous Wish book. And it's just something I bookmarked in my head because it sounded so interesting. And
it is.
As much of it is about the people you're with as the journey itself, perhaps.
Yeah, we had a group of people, like I said last year, and this is an extreme adventure by no means. We had to take 2 planes to get up to Fairbanks, and then we had to rent vehicles and drive into Canada, and then drive up this essentially 400 miles of dirt road. And we were away from. There was no cell service. There's a sign that says no medical services here. You're going into it's an adventure. You got to do those things, I think, in your life to kind of give yourself a little thrill. And we swam in the Arctic Ocean, which was really cool when we got up there. So I forget where I was going or what you were saying, but anyway.
It seems like it's as much about the people you were with.
Oh yeah, so we had a group of people thank you. We had a group of people. We had a couple who were in their late 70s. My son was with me; he's 23, and we had all in different age ranges. And we had 3 different cars, and we were just all taking care of each other and enjoying it. I mean, we saw grizzly bears on the side of the road, which was pretty incredible, to see them right there. So Yeah, you get to do some fun stuff doing. It's just sort of a way I mean, you could go take a vacation and do these kinds of things without geocaching. You don't need
Yeah.
geocaching to do it, but um, this, this is sort of a template that falls on that, and it brings you to places you might not normally go. So,
Very, very cool. And I just love the whole bond, like the bonding aspect. And I want to try some of this out with my kids as well.
yeah.
But yeah, like I said, you mentioned that when we were talking about the missing pieces for your last book. Are there any missing pieces for this book?
Uh, you mean stuff that I wrote that I didn't put in?
Yeah.
Oh boy, there might be a little bit. I thought you were going to ask, are there missing pieces of Mulholland Drive, which
That was the
there
next.
are, and I was going to write about them, and I deliberately did not. They didn't fit with the thesis, and also I mean, I don't know, Lynch will probably never see this book. Some respect for, I mean, he obviously, the pilot was not what he wanted people to see, and I talk about the pilot in this book. There are portions of the pilot that he cut out that I have seen that I did not write about. And that may not be enough. Maybe just write anything about it is too much for him. But I really do believe there was a value in seeing his creative process and how he went from one to another. And there were scenes that he cut that didn't add to that exploration. And at first I was like, oh, I'm going to write about these scenes and I can tell people about them. And then I thought, no, he didn't want people to see them. And so I didn't put him in there.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And and you spent a lot of time talking with me, and I really do appreciate that. Not today necessarily, of course today as well, but over the past I don't know how many months or years, but
Yeah.
yeah, I really appreciate that. One of the best discussions that we had was the missing pieces discussion about. I think I titled it "The Art of Editing,"
Mm.
all the editing decisions that you made in the last book. And I'm only saying that out loud just in case anybody's watching. Because I want to plug that one because that was one of the best. That was probably my proudest episode that I've ever created. That was really good.
Yeah. You obviously you had the advantage of reading the stuff that got cut. It's sort of like
Yeah,
what we were just talking about to some extent, not really. But I hope other people would find value in it and watch it, but they can't read the stuff that I cut out. But we talked about reasons why, and that, I mean, I think designing the book and thinking about it, you do, yeah. I mean, I'm sure I went down a few tangents that I I know with this book, unlike the Ominous Whoosh, there wasn't a lot of wasted writing. I kind of knew
yeah.
what it was going to be.
Another thing that you did for me, maybe for you as well, is I asked you to read a passage from your last book, and you were reading about the Glastonbury Grove scene. I think part 17, maybe.
Okay.
I'm wondering if I could ask you to do that again.
Can you give me that?
Yeah, I have it picked out. If you have
Oh,
it,
you have it.
do you have
Well,
it on hand by any chance?
I'll go on right here.
All right, 115.
Page 115
Yeah.
on page. Oh, yeah. Sure. About the middle of 115. Yep. Do you want me to read from there to the end? I could do that.
Would you mind?
No, I don't mind. That's actually a good section because I wasn't sure. There's certain sections that don't work unless you lead up to them. And
Yeah.
okay, so yeah, this is the afterword. And so this is after I've gone through the history and the analysis of Mulholland Drive. So making Mulholland Drive the story of a unique, albeit tragic character is how David Lynch salvaged the Mulholland Drive TV pilot. Lynch understood that for the story to have meaning, to connect with audiences on a visceral level, to have the power to move us emotionally, it had to have a human being at its core. When we watch Mulholland Drive for the first time, we don't know we're seeing a story told through a dreaming mind. We don't realize we're witnessing the reflections of a troubled psyche. Only at the end of the film, in Act 3, do we become aware of the larger story at play. By then, and especially if we're watching the film in the theater, it's too late to go back and untangle Diane's dream to see how it conveys her various anxieties and desires. But when we rewatch Mulholland Drive, we evaluate it with different context. We read Mulholland Drive's first act as a dream, and we see a deliberate scheme at play. The construction of the film, the arrangement of and transition between scenes, the use of sound and music, the movement of the camera encodes Diane's fear, guilt, and objection. A sense of desperation permeates the whole of it, implying a mind behind the story. Hidden in its discursive shadows, masterly interpolated by David Lynch, Diane Selwyn is a presence throughout. Mulholland Drive puts forth a puzzle, and it's up to us to put the pieces together. Daunting and elusive, haunting and elusive, Mulholland Drive opens minds.
How'd you feel reading that? Was that?
I liked that. I liked that part. It reminded me. I was in Snoqualmie up at the Twin Peaks days up there, February 24th, and I was pretty much done with the book, but I hadn't written this section yet. And I was staying with some people who were huge Lynch fans and stuff, and they were like, well, "How much left do you have to go?" I go, "Well, when I get home, I got to write. I got to write this afterward. I got to kind of summarize it all. I've got to get it condensed down, and that when it's not written yet, it's really kind of daunting. It's really kind of it weighs on you. And so it took a little while. It's only the afterword is literally only 2 pages long, and it took some time to write it. And then that last sentence must have gone through 5 different iterations. It was different. It had different ways of ending. I wanted to have something kind of poetic, something that was good. Honestly, I mean, that took days just to get the ending right. It took a long time. It just occurred to me as I was reading. I'm reading it real fast. I'm like, oh, it took me a while to write that. So that's what came to mind.
It worked. And I like the repetition of the word elusive and then elusive. I know I'm exaggerating, but just for audio, it's cool. And that word elusive, that has illusion in it, yes?
Allusion, as in alluding to something, as in implying or hinting at. Elusive meaning it escapes from your grasp, and elusive meaning it kind of hints at what it means. The value of having a dictionary and a thesaurus beside you while you're writing is how that sentence came to be.
Okay. Yeah, and I learned words like superlunary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know exactly where that word exists in the book. I knew that word. I knew it. I had never used it in a sentence, but I knew it. I knew, sometimes there's a word and you can't. This happened to me more than once where I don't even know how to spell it. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but I know it's there and I know what it means. And so then I have to go look for it. And then because I knew that was superlunary was a word that sort of meant outside of the normal existence, above reality. And I was like, I know that word. It's awful when you can't find it. I walk around the house. I know that word, and no other word will do until I find it. And then I remembered it or came across it again. So.
Yeah. So we went full circle because I think my first question was the diction, i.e. the word choice in your title.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about the word choice at the end of the book. And
definitely.
I think I should be respectful enough to you and your family to let you. But
it's 9:00. I better go. Yeah. I better go.
And tomorrow's my daughter's second day of school, so I'm gonna go help her with.
Good. Yeah.
But John, thanks, man.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for showing the interest that you did. And I mean, again, cut some of this stuff, but you know, you did help me. You pointed out some things in the chapters I sent to you that I missed, and I acknowledged you in the book because I do appreciate your interest very much. I truly do. I mean, you know, it's nice when someone shows an interest in what you're doing because you know, like you said, it is a lonely thing. You're writing it.
Yeah.
You don't know if anyone's going to read it. So I'm very appreciative of it.
You got it, man. My pleasure. And very good to see you.
Yeah.
My friend told me that I'm supposed to ask the other person how they could be reached. Like
Oh,
Twitter or whatnot. So
yeah, I'm on Twitter. I don't know for how long. I'm still there. At Thornwhip, THORNEWIP. I'm also on Instagram on the same. So I've tried to move over to Instagram a little more. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to contact me, you could do that through there and send me a message or something.
all right.
All right.
John, thanks again.
You bet. Take care. We'll see you.
Okay, bye-bye.